Hi, everybody. My name is Shireen Harry-Turan. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Lawson Health Research Institute. I am really excited to be presenting here with you today. I work for Dr. Ruth Lanius, whose research focuses on post-traumatic stress disorder. And today we're going to be talking about sensory processing in PTSD, and specifically how interoceptive sensations that we perceive from our internal world and exteroceptive sensations from our external world, and how those converge and shape bodily perception and shape how individuals engage with the world, specifically in the aftermath of trauma. And so to talk about sensory processing, we first need to kind of delve into what it is and what we mean by it. So sensory processing is the ability to interpret and organize incoming sensory information from both the external world, so what we typically see as senses, visual senses, touch senses, auditory, smelling sensations, vestibular sensations, proprioception, all of those are external sensations. But there's also that internal world that's just as important to consider, and these are more of these raw, visceral sensations. For example, fear, feeling numb, feeling joy, but also those physiological sensations as well. So, arousal, up or down, feeling your heart racing, feeling cold, shallow breathing, deep breathing, all of those are sensations that are in our internal world. And so we talked about, an exteroceptive sensation, and so that's the perception of the body from the outside, and it's based on the external stimuli we see in our world and what we experience. And internal sensory information is also really important, and that's the sense of the internal physiological state of the body, and these, so this arousal, this temperature, breathing, and also the raw affective emotional states, fear and numbing and joy. And why it's so important to focus on this internal world is because not only does it lay the foundation for what we perceive externally, but for individuals with trauma, the internal world is essentially dysregulated, and that's very characteristic of the disorder. And so extreme emotion dysregulation in PTSD, which is how PTSD is characterized, and it can affect how we perceive, how the external world is interpreted. And so it's so important to look at PTSD through the lens of sensory processing because the internal world is so affected. In PTSD you see alterations in arousal, fear-driven responses, a lack of feeling safe, and all of these affect how we perceive the external world. And so Winnie Dunn developed a model of sensory processing in 1997 that talked about how every individual processes sensory information uniquely. And so it got to thinking about kind of how individuals with PTSD perceive sensory information. And somebody hypothesized, Yeager hypothesized, that individuals with PTSD may be more predisposed to hypersensitivity patterns, especially when they are hypervigilant of their surroundings and they're consistently examining their surroundings or scanning their environment for threat. But it's also important to know that individuals with PTSD may also have hyposensitivity patterns. For individuals that are dissociative and feel things like endorse feelings like I feel dead inside, or if they have an altered perception of their self and their surroundings, they may experience a bit more emotional withdrawal and maybe have an altered perception of where they are in space. And they may be more hyposensitive, so they may not perceive touch stimuli, feel a lack of balance, feel that more numbing sensation. And so it's important to consider that both, the classic PTSD where there's more hyperarousal and more hyperemotionality, there's also this converse state, this opposing state. So it's important to consider both of them. But both of them can be analyzed through the lens of sensory processing because there's that hypersensitivity and that hyposensitivity component to it. And so the typical chain of sensory transmission in healthy individuals is that this internal and external world sensations converge at the level of the brainstem. And so both that's how we experience sensations. So both the internal world sensations can reach different areas of the brainstem, also for those from the external world, and eventually these are translated to the insula, where you develop more of awareness of a sensory experience. And that's the interoceptive inference, where the external and the internal converge, and you're starting to become more aware of it. And then to gain context of it requires the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the executive functioning hub of the brain that's responsible for integrating these senses, so multisensory integration, but it's also important for emotion regulation, which is affected in PTSD. So the prefrontal cortex, if there are aberrations in terms of emotion regulation, there may also be effects of multisensory integration, negative effects of multisensory integration as well among individuals with PTSD. And so we developed a framework through which to look at sensory processing. We talked about this chain of sensory transmission with the brainstem to the insula to the prefrontal cortex. And so the brainstem encompasses the exteroceptive and interoceptive sensations, that phenomenology of sensory experience. And then it eventually goes to the insula, where these external and internal sensations converge and you develop awareness of a sensory experience. And then to develop context of it, at the prefrontal cortex, that's for a multisensory integration, where we're able to integrate it and be able to respond to it. And then the embodied self is when you're able to be attuned to your surroundings. So you're able to understand what's going on, respond appropriately, and develop a higher order perception of it. And that's what, the apex of sensory processing is, and that's the apex of where you kind of want to be in that attunement between yourself and the world. And so how is this theoretical framework impacted in PTSD? And so if we start at the base of the hierarchy, where at the level of the brainstem, where there's that phenomenology of sensory experience, interoceptive sensations lay the foundation for which exteroceptive sensory information is interpreted. So if our internal world is very dysregulated and if it's characterized by these fear states and these hyper and hypoarousal states, it can affect the base of the hierarchy is affected, and it affects how you perceive the external world on top of that. It affects multisensory integration. It affects how both these external world and internal world sensations are perceived. And so it's so important to consider that in individuals with PTSD, if those aberrations exist at the level of the brainstem, which they do, then it can affect how the external world is interpreted. And I wanted to zero in a bit about the exteroceptive sensation. So we talked about how if the internal world is affected, then the external world is also affected. And the external world, a really important system to consider in that is the vestibular system. And the vestibular system is so important for balance and maintaining our center of gravity that allows for safe movement in space. And this is a subconscious system that's constantly working and constantly keeping our center of gravity and allowing us to maintain balance in space. And so what we wanted to look at we looked at vestibular nuclei connectivity during rest among individuals with PTSD and those with the PTSD dissociative subtype and those with healthy controls. And the vestibular nuclei connects to different areas in the brain that are responsible for both interoceptive and exteroceptive processing. So for the interoceptive processing, it connects to the posterior insula. For exteroceptive processing, it connects to a place called the TPJ, which helps decide between which is really important for sensory processing. And then it also connects to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for multisensory integration. And what was interesting is that in the study, we saw that in healthy controls and even in individuals, this was intact. But among individuals with the PTSD dissociative subtype, we saw while there was connectivity with the insula, there was no connectivity with the exteroceptive processing or the multisensory integration. And it just shows the nature of that stepwise process where, if there's aberrant connections between the brainstem and the TPJ for exteroceptive processing, then there's that lack of integration at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, but also shows how important both exteroceptive and interoceptive sensations are. In individuals with PTSD with dissociative symptoms, there's that altered perception of self and surroundings and feeling like you're in a dream or feeling that maybe outside your body. And that affects that exteroceptive sensation and how you're experiencing the external world. And if you're seeing those effects, then ultimately it can't reach the prefrontal cortex for multisensory integration. And so if you don't have a sense of self, it's difficult to know how to navigate in your environment, how to navigate through your environment. And then if you look at the interoceptive inference, and so that's at the level of the insula is a key node for converging exteroceptive and interoceptive sensory information. It creates awareness of a sensory experience and helps identify the emotion that underlies it. And it's so important, and the insula is such a key structure because it receives information from the brainstem, but also translates it to the prefrontal cortex. And we conducted a study during resting state as well. And what we saw is that in individuals with PTSD, in healthy controls, the insula was relaying information, or was connecting to higher order frontal structures in the brain, including the prefrontal cortex and the pre and post central gyrus, are in areas involved with environmental monitoring and emotion appraisal. But individuals with PTSD, they showed more sub-region connectivity with subcortical structures involved with hyperemotionality or hyperarousal. And then in the dissociative subjects, it stayed more restricted, but it also stayed more in the occipital areas and involved with more implicit neural processes, including implicit memory. And so that was really interesting, is that typical chain of sensory transmission that I showed you earlier, where it goes from the brainstem to the insula to the prefrontal cortex, that was not seen among individuals with PTSD. Instead, it stayed in the more subcortical structures, in the survival brain, what we call it, in the limbic and brainstem structures that are involved with, sustaining hypervigilance symptoms and hyperemotionality. And among individuals that experienced dissociation, again, the insula did not show connectivity to the prefrontal cortex, but it instead showed more connectivity with the occipital lobe, which in this context may be more associated with implicit memory and more visual imagery because their eyes were closed in the scanner. And then eventually, we have to consider the dorsal prefrontal cortex. So we talked about how individuals with PTSD with the insula connectivity, it did not show that connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. But how can we engage then the prefrontal cortex? It's critical for multisensory integration, it's critical for emotion regulation, and it has structures within them that work in tandem to facilitate this. So the goal a lot of treatment for PTSD, and especially for sensory motor based treatments, is to bring online that prefrontal cortex, because it helps kind of gain context to sensory experience for multisensory integration, but also help regulate emotions that underlie them. And so there are two networks within the executive control network. So the executive control network, so important for the prefrontal cortex navigating emotion regulation and multisensory integration. But there's also the default mode network, which is the introspective self-based network, and how we monitor our attention, which is more involved with sensory motor processing and visual attentional processing. And together, in tandem, it's thought that this dorsal attention network and that introspective network can work in tandem to bring online the executive network for more emotion regulation. And so targeting bringing online that dorsal prefrontal cortex is so important. And so if we can target, the attention network, adjunctive sensory motor treatments that use different, whether it's eye movements or different sensory equipment, can bring online both that and kind of evoke emotions in the more introspective processing. These may work in tandem to facilitate activation of the executive frontoparietal network, including the dorsal prefrontal cortex. And emotion regulation, if you bring that online, then the dorsal prefrontal cortex can initiate emotion regulation through top-down reappraisal. And so what we also see is that if you initiate eye movements, you can bring online these prefrontal cortex areas involved with emotion regulation. And these in turn may assist in reintegration of traumatic memories and be a treatment for PTSD, like has been seen with an EMDR treatment, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which uses sensory stimuli to help reintegrate traumatic memories, but also help with emotion regulation. So it's so important to we're starting to understand maybe more of the neural underpinnings of sensory motor treatments, but for trauma. But this is starting to gain traction in the field, and it's really important to consider these. And so, we're starting a lot more body-oriented therapies, and including smart therapy as well. And eventually, if you're able to kind of use these sensory motor treatments to bring online that prefrontal cortex and that bring online these areas for multisensory integration, we eventually want to reach the apex of this hierarchy, which is the embodied self, and increasing that sense of agency. So, if you're having more an embodied self, you're more attuned to what's going on around you. You're feeling a sense of stillness and balance, and feeling more comfortable in your body and in your surroundings. And the mind and body are more interactive, and they're attuned to each other, and it helps regulate both the internal world as well. And so these are kind of these adjunctive ways, these adjunctive sensory motor treatments can be a really great way of potentially looking at this and attaining that embodied self. So I'd want to thank everybody that works in our group. So Dr. Ruth Lanius, I work for, and I also work at McMaster as well. So I want to thank Dr. McKinnon and our entire team. Thank you guys so much. Take care.
Welcome everybody. I'll be talking about a pilot investigation and the results that we got out of it. That was investigating neurofeedback as an adjunct therapy for PTSD within the indigenous Haida population. The idea behind this project was to really integrate this neurofeedback protocol within the cultural belief system and see how a culturally appropriate therapy as such would work out. So mental health in Canadian Indigenous populations is a major challenge for the Canadian healthcare system. Years and years of oppression, trauma has left this population with disproportionately higher levels of trauma-based mental health disorders. They also have an increased vulnerability for re-traumatization, both with respect to natural events that occur that bear resemblance to the trauma or even don't bear resemblance to the trauma, and even through improper provision of care. So if the care isn't provided in a culturally sensitive manner, it can actually further harm the patients rather than lead to improvements. Hence, therapies can be better integrated culturally, and an effort needs to be made to do so. And hence, there is a need for these studies that take widely popular therapies for PTSD and customize it for indigenous populations by integrating it within their cultural belief system and providing such a culturally appropriate care. This current study focused on the last 2 points by first culturally integrating the neurofeedback therapy into the Haida belief system, and also studying this in a manner that is quite unique and was done in a way that was very culturally appropriate and allowed us to work with the Haida population to understand what works best for their needs. As is quite evident from years of research in this field, neurofeedback is very popular as an adjunct PTSD treatment option, with years of research in the general population showing that it is an effective therapy and can ameliorate PTSD symptom severity, and it's especially useful in meeting the needs of specialized populations such as war veterans, as shown by some of the papers cited here. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on alpha-down neurofeedback within this study, where alpha-down neurofeedback has been shown in reducing symptom severity and also renormalizing underlying brain networks, such as the DMN salience network and the central executive network, among a few other ones. However, despite this amount of research and expertise going into understanding how neurofeedback affects the general population, very few studies have actually investigated neurofeedback in Canadian Indigenous communities, and even so, they haven't really looked at this in a culturally integrated manner. So this study is one of the first studies that is looking at this kind of approach where we're integrating the neurofeedback protocol with the Haida belief system and providing this entire care in a very culturally appropriate manner. Hence, this study addresses this major need to investigate a culturally integrated neurofeedback therapy, and we're investigating this in a very culturally appropriate, using a very culturally appropriate methodology, as will be discussed shortly. To accomplish this, we worked with a therapist from the Hyder community who was very interested in piloting this alpha-down neurofeedback protocol to see if this is something that could be feasibly deployed within the Hyder community. So 20 participants were recruited from the community by this therapist and were then part of the alpha-down neurofeedback protocol. This alpha-down neurofeedback was administered at the Ptsd electrode and will be talked about in the next slide. To really customize this alpha-down neurofeedback protocol, it was also accompanied by customized therapy as and when the therapist deemed it fit or deemed necessary. So, for example, some participants really started processing the trauma and felt like they needed some additional help to process the bodily sensations that they were coming up with when they were processing the trauma. And so the therapist engaged in some somatic work, some body work to help the participant process this. And this combined with the alpha-down neurofeedback, which is provided 2 times a week for about a maximum of 16 weeks, made up the current adjunct alpha-down neurofeedback protocol. It is important to also note that the reward threshold was titrated by the therapist based on the participant's performance level and mood level at each session. The alpha-down neurofeedback was also provided with the Muse headband with an extra electrode at the Ptsd electrode position point. So this Ptsd point is where the alpha-down protocol was implemented, and the participants were instructed to decrease the alpha at this point. They were presented the neurofeedback signal through the means of mind lift games, where they had the choice of picking a game that they were most comfortable with and they felt like they could control it the best. Each data was collected at about 220 Hertz by the Muse headband and stored in mind lift, and the alpha power, which is the power between 8 to 12 Hertz of EEG activity, was calculated and reported at each session of the alpha-down neurofeedback. So this was done for all the 20 participants, and based on the results, based on that data, we noticed some very interesting trends. Firstly, a majority of the participants reported really positive mood changes. Almost all of them noticed that they felt a lot better, and many of them reporting that their sleep improved as well. When we looked at the trajectory of alpha power throughout the entire session period, we noticed some interesting trends. Majority of the participants had this biphasic peak of alpha power, where the alpha power peaked at around the 8 to 12 session point, and after which it dropped and stayed low until it increased back again towards the end. Now, what was interesting was this peak was very highly correlated with the participants' mood. When they started performing alpha-down neurofeedback, it took them a while to get used to it and start being able to control it. And their mood increased significantly up until the 8 to 12 session time point. But what we did notice was at this point the participants were being more in touch with their body, were able to unlock certain aspects of their trauma that they had potentially locked away. This put them in a mindset where they had to actively process their trauma, and this is where the therapist provided the most appropriate therapy alongside neurofeedback. So, be that somatic therapy, body work, or even participation in cultural activities. All of these helped assimilate the neurofeedback experiences that the participants were having within the cultural context, and allowed them to really process this as a therapy of their own, rather than really see this as something else that is foreign to them. The participants that were able to go through this sessions and really process their trauma eventually led to an increase in alpha power, as we noticed towards the end of their sessions. And at this point, they also displayed really improved mood and in their interactions with the therapist. Now, admittedly, this results the positive correlation that we observe between the person's mood and the overall alpha power mirrored the alpha rebound effect that we had observed previously um, with the alpha down neurofeedback and some of the previous studies that I had mentioned before. This alpha rebound effect is thought to happen due to the brain's homeostatic uh, mechanisms that are trying to increase alpha uh, in baseline after the alpha down neurofeedback is performed. This is thought to re-normalize some of the brain networks and increase recruitment of some of the salience networks, for example. Um, Given that we see such an effect within the highlight community, we could expect to see such changes if brain imaging was performed, and should be the content of a future study. It is important to note that the study was not accompanied by standardized questionnaires collected before and after the neurofeedback protocol, as would be expected from such a neurofeedback study. This was done to prevent any sort of re-traumatization of the participants in our study based on prior trauma from research experiments within the population. This was quite critical in maintaining the cultural appropriateness of the study and the neurofeedback protocol. And what we found that the community, the Highlight community, was very receptive towards the neurofeedback protocol, and found that it was not all that different from some of their Haida beliefs, and were quite open to incorporating this within the Haida healthcare system, and potentially accessing it if and when possible. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hello, my name is Jenny Liu, and I am a postdoctoral associate at the McDonnell Franklin OSI Research Center and an adjunct research professor in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm so excited today to be presenting treatment approaches and efficacy for post-traumatic stress disorder in military populations, a meta-analysis and systematic review. Before I begin, I want to share that I have no conflict or perceived conflicts of interest to disclose. And for the purpose of this presentation, there are two learning objectives I hope you can take away from by the end of today. First is to identify the steps taken to conduct a comprehensive meta-analysis that examines the effectiveness of pharmacotherapies and psychotherapies in treating PTSD in military and veteran populations. And second is to really describe the considerations and challenges in treatment selection based on characteristics of the individual, of treatment, and of clinical symptomology. So before we begin, I want to touch base on why we are conducting this review. So we know that the prevalence for PTSD is higher in military populations compared to civilians, and that's due to several factors. First, because of their higher levels of exposure to potentially traumatic events. The second is also because of their unique experiences and exposures. Their PTSD features are distinct from the PTSD experienced by those of civilians. And as a result, military and veteran populations also share differences in the way that they respond to available treatments. Currently, there are lots of evidence available to document the types of treatments, anything ranging from psychotherapies to pharmacotherapies to alternative, emerging, combination therapies. However, existing reviews of their relative efficacy are mixed. Some are finding that psychotherapies are more effective. Some are finding that pharmacotherapies are more effective. Other reviews have found no specific differences in their efficacy. However, more efforts are required to really disentangle factors that might be contributing to these mixed findings. The purpose of our review really then is to substantiate the available evidence of treatment approaches in treating military-related PTSD. And today I'll be overviewing the protocols for our meta-analysis and systematic review. I'll start with an overview of the search strategy that we used for our search, and then review the eligibility criteria that we evaluated studies against. I'll also overview some of the anticipated outcomes of our review, and finally end off with challenges and considerations for conducting this review and for the evidence that we hope to find. Our search strategy was finalized in mid-April of this year, and full disclosure, we're still in the middle of conducting our meta-analysis. Our search strategy hit 3 areas. The first is treatment, trial, or intervention, where we try to use these mesh terms to expand and catch any studies that really looked at or had some form of treatment or intervention. The second group of mesh words was military combat soldiers or veterans, to catch the population specific to our review. And last but not least, we specified the terms PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder to finally narrow down the clinical symptom clusters that we're interested in. We combined all of the 3 groups of searches and restricted the date to 1980, which was when PTSD first started showing up in the DSM. For our eligibility criteria, we try to be as inclusive as possible to catch all of the available evidence. And so studies were included if they had adult populations that were military or veterans that had diagnosis of PTSD under either DSM or ICD categories or versions. Studies were included if they had some form of treatment, whether psychological, pharmacological, alternative, or any kind of combinations in between. And finally, studies were included if they had a continuous assessment or measurement of PTSD symptoms, or looked at the change between pre and post intervention. As indicated earlier, we tried to err on the side of inclusivity. So we really yielded a huge amount of studies with our search. We searched across 5 databases, including PsycInfo, Medline, Embase, CINAHL, and ProQuest dissertation and theses, and ended up with 19,783 studies in total. After deduplicating, we began our abstract and title screening with 12,002 records. We completed the title and abstract screening and also proceeded to the full text review, which further narrowed it down to 1,469. And finally, we are at the final stage of screening. Final stage of screening where we're assessing the last bit of studies retained for their full eligibility. So we have over 600 studies now that we're currently assessing for eligibility, and those would include making sure that the author contact for any missing information, and also conflict resolution in case of disagreements between the raters. For our meta-analysis and systematic review, we hope to have two sets of primary outcomes. First is really to build a database of the available evidence in treating military-related PTSD. So we really want to have this evolving database that tracks all of the treatments, all of the outcomes, and their effects found. But we also want to overview the quality of evidence in treating military-related PTSD and focusing on two different areas of quality. The first quality that I want to touch on is the intervention finality, or the quality of the intervention as it's carried out. Things that we're looking for on the fidelity side include are the trainers or facilitators well trained to carry out the intervention? Is the intervention carried out consistently? Is it following a particular manual and such? The other area of quality that we're interested in examining is the quality of the research itself. So more specifically, the research rigor. So how rigorous are the researchers in carrying out their study? Are they justified in their sample size? Are they well-powered to find any effects? Or are they even well-powered to conduct the statistical analyses that they are conducting and such? So I touched upon research rigor and intervention quality, and also the effectiveness of treatment. And generally, we want to then arrive at a state of evidence after accounting for all of these factors, and also look at their specific nuances between PTSD symptom change relative to treatment efficacy, research rigor, intervention quality, as well as treatment considerations and population considerations. So some examples include for PTSD symptom change, how effective are treatments based on the type of measurement tools that are used in research. For example, there are self-report measures. There are also clinician-administered measures. Are there differences in treatment efficacy as a result of the selection of tools? For treatment consideration, we might want to look at how single treatments versus combination treatments versus augmentation treatments, how their effectiveness might differ. If we look at a real life context, for example, if I am a treatment seeking veteran, I might be coming into an OSI for the first time, or operational stress injury clinic for the first time, because I'm interested in getting some medication for PTSD. But I might have had a psychologist that I'm receiving psychotherapy from for multiple years through my general physician. And so as a result, how might different interventions or different treatments interact with one another? And how might this be mimicked in a research setting? Are research studies conducted purely through washouts and very rigorous, but also very clean in that, you know, participants can only engage in this study if they've never received prior treatment? Or how are they accounting for existing treatments, whether it's treatment as usual or whether they're implementing some type of washout and such? And finally, there are important population considerations that we want to look at across the board. For example, how representative are the populations in research relative to actual military and veteran populations? If all the studies are conducted with Vietnam veterans who are, older in age, are typically Caucasian and male, how might that those evidence of effectiveness translate to other sort of diversities that we see in military and veteran populations? Are they representative of all the populations? And also, how might those different population characteristics influence or interact with other factors that influence effectiveness of treatments? So we hope to generally answer all of these questions and then arrive at a state of evidence such that we can say, for this group of population receiving this type of treatment, we might expect that they are going to have this kind of response. So we might be able to tap into some of those algorithms so we can better understand the interactions or the pathways of treatment response. And of course, we encounter some challenges and considerations in our review as well. Anytime we do any type of meta-analysis or large-scale reviews, there's lots of heterogeneities or lots of sort of variabilities in the literature, and so really trying to make sense of those variabilities. And this is further compounded by complexities of patient populations. For example, what happens if you have some participants in research studies that can participate and still receive treatment as usual, and others that are, undergoing much more rigorous screening of eligibility and inclusion. We also want to really tease apart the effectiveness of treatment, whether it's due to purely the treatment protocols or the manual or the intervention itself, or due to its delivery, whether that's due to the patient or therapeutic alliance with the therapist, or whether that's due to the format or mode of delivery, like online, kind of like how we're having this session now. And finally, I want to be also cautious of over or underestimation of effects and overrepresentation of different populations, because the military and veteran populations are typically a hard to reach population. So lots of studies are multi-year in nature and therefore might have multiple populations, and really trying to conservatively estimate their effect and not overrepresent those populations in the longitudinal studies or studies with multiple populations. So I just want to end this presentation by acknowledging the larger research team and authors. These include the research leads at the McDonald-Franklin OSI Research Center, our wonderful group of advisors and collaborators across Canada, and of course the staff and volunteers at the McDonald-Franklin OSI Research Center. Our project is also supported in funding from the St. Joseph Foundation, as well as from the Center of Excellence for PTSD. And finally, these are some of the references used in the current presentation. And with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to present. And I look forward to connecting with you.